Title of this session is Culture Lab, Real Violence, Israel-Palestine, Justice and Justification. All of us here have watched some debates, let's call them, that Piers Morgan has hosted. The first one with a lady named Rama Zain. She was in debate with the son of one of the founders of Hamas, Mossab Hassan Youssef, who is now, I think it's fair to say, a representative of Israel's more aggressive positioning in this context. He's worked and perhaps still works for the Mossad, and he's a fascinating character. Also shared an interview that he did with Jordan Peterson. I'll share all these links in the description. I think these are particularly interesting pieces of media to engage with in relationship to this conflict.
Well, to debate this, I'm joined by the Egyptian podcaster Rama Zain and by the son of Hamas's founder and former Palestinian militant Mossab Hassan Youssef. Well, welcome to both of you, both returning to Uncensored.
I also shared a dialogue that was a follow-up between Mossab Hassan Youssef and Abi Martin, who's a vocal and powerful representation of the left-wing, let's say, political perspective in the media space on this conflict. Difficult thing to open in many ways, because to speak even in some sense across the top neutrally like that, who are these people, who are they representing? God knows, to be totally honest with you.
Israel needs to be stopped before they continue this horrific onslaught, Piers.
This is war. In war, people die. Abby does not have the authority. She's just a self-appointed, low-grade journalist.
You're a spy for Israeli intelligence.
It's an absolutely wild thing to truly relate with in the depths, which we've tried to on a number of occasions. Now, I'll just read out one paragraph that I also shared in this description by way of intention. So I intend the title of this session, Real Violence, Israel-Palestine, Justice and Justification, to invite a grapple with the constraints of discourse in our society, and perhaps the constraints of discourse as such, in relation to the heart of what matters, our ethics, value itself, in consideration of the nature of brokenness, tragedy, and possibility in our world. So in a sense, that's quite a mouthful. What I'm hoping for today is for us to well, I'm certainly here to reattune with what's at stake in the context of this cultural moment, with openness to see and feel and understand, insofar as that's possible, the complexity and the tragedy, as well as the hope regarding this conflict in particular, as well as what it means for our moment in civilization. And in this context, I'm particularly curious about how we collectively process this, how we collectively relate to it in the space of discourse, how in some sense our desire for justice, our deep sense and care for what matters, insofar as we are to any degree consciously relating with that, and maybe not, maybe it doesn't matter if we're consciously relating so much, perhaps there is an unconscious patterning, some proto-conscious relation with telos. Nevertheless, this relationship between the justice that we might seek in our hearts and the tremendous barrier and pain and constriction and inadequacy of meeting each other in the process of justification, that in principle in the cultural space is there to help mediate and enable our way toward justice. And so that's why those two words are there, this relation between justice and justification. The part of the title that speaks to the real violence element. Well, this is an energy that I think beyond just about any other that I've seen with such a large platform in the present cultural dialogue about this, Mossab Hassan Youssef there is an energy of real violence, its consequences and its realities, which comes through in his expression, in the story of his life, tremendous traumas, an unbelievable life story. And it's worth speaking to, it's worth speaking with. It must be taken into account. And the consequence of that, of course, and this is the final thing I'll say by way of opening, is that in the case of Israel and Palestine, we have here tens of thousands of people, of course, over the course of history on both sides, but tens of thousands of people in recent history in Israel's response to the roughly 1,000 dead, more injured, it's a little bit under 1,000. On October 7, you have tens of thousands of people, men, women, and children, many of whom, it's interesting. What do we mean by innocent? Certainly the children are innocent, are they not? Hey, thousands of children. Is it a genocide? Does it matter? At least the compassion and deep care for that situation is also something to be metabolized by the opening of the question of what does it mean to relate with real violence. That is how I open that. So that's what I'm here with. I'm looking forward to unfolding this dialogue with you. We'll see what we can manage to help each other to see and metabolize. So with that said, I'd like to pass it over to Jacob. Jacob, I'm wondering how you meet this conversation. I know you have a background of interest in this, so you're welcome to share some of that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. You've outdone yourself on creating the kind of entry that my heart longs to see created in this dialogue, but my mind doesn't exactly know how to bring that about. And so for me, this dialogue is really it holds the potential of a profound integration of, for me, like 5-6 years of thinking about Islam in the West whilst doing postgraduate studies in this area and really letting my experiences with LSD and the kind of integration of disciplines and knowledge kind of seep into how I was approaching those questions. And so whenever there's a jihadist incident in Europe or this conflict being both different and connected with that quite deeply, it's like a conversation and a journey and an intellectual landscape reopens. And yeah, it's enormously challenging, I think, to do what Tim is pointing us towards. And in some ways this would be a real awful simplification, but maybe a useful starting one is that you could see people responding with heart and without mind, and people responding with mind and without heart. And I would broadly divide those as a emotive, heart-led response on the progressive side, but that doesn't really address all of the realities that the more classical liberal and neoconservative voices are articulating, particularly around the problems of Islamism, quote Marx, knowing the limitations of that word and being actually a Western word, still a useful way of describing the phenomenon of Islam as a political system and a political goal, and that extended at the edge into jihadism as a violent manifestation of that in conventional warfare and also in what people started to call atmospheric jihad, which is unlike back in the day, it was a cell or something, a network. Al-Qaeda was a network. But we've reached a point now where this is the culture war milieu is the same milieu that produces people willing to undertake these kinds of really violent acts and to experience a degree of feeling aligned with one's highest purpose in the context of doing it, not simply doing it out of hatred or rebellion or nihilism, but also from a sense of being in line with righteousness. And this is very, very troubling indeed, especially in relation to the character of October the 7th and the character of other recent jihadist movements such as Islamic State and their pretty barbaric campaign of execution of journalists and innocent people as part of their terror campaign. So there was an enormous amount in the 66 questions that I put there. And as you've said, I'm not going to attempt to bring that in. I'm really just kind of trying to feel my way into this conversation and putting an enormous amount of trust in the integrity of this space and what I've seen developing in this space in the last few dialogues. It feels like, there's nowhere I would sooner want to attempt this reconciliation of mind and heart and sacred and carnal kind of, base level protective instincts and all the way up to unitive experience. So that's where I would kind of contextualize this conversation for me. And thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. I think that last point you made is really right on. How to relate with this in a manner that incorporates heart, mind, and then you mentioned the instinct and the carnal aspect of that, the necessity for protection, the instinct towards self-preservation, the protection of one's own kind, of one's own children. One of the things that's been so starkly absent from the majority of, let's say, discourse is just the openness in the field of relationality to presence with the kind of performative power enabling of the remembrance of just that energy towards, but wait, my back's up against the wall and I feel like my kids are in danger. It's a different thing. It's a different thing to be speaking from that place. It's a different thing to be speaking from a place of protecting your family, of feeling like there's no other option. Justification be damned. If that's where the affect is, if we feel surrounded on all sides, if we feel occupied, if we feel oppressed, irrespective for a moment, although it's important to bring in, critical to bring in the religious aspect of what then, let's say, bluntly runs the worldview of Hamas, of the radical aspect of Islam, which indeed does seem to be incompatible with a healthy participation, even in the context of pluralism. Now, saying that, there we go, bam, okay, that's a clear thing I've just stepped on there. Deserves 4 hours of response. I'm not necessarily directing us there. In part, I suppose the benefit, and to the degree there is integrity in this context, it means that we need not feel as though we are beholden to play out every string of justification necessary for every possible point of disagreement or potential misperception and strong value judgment as to that's the most profane thing ever to say, immediately othered. Okay, well, let me just string out the 10,000 memes to get you back on side with that right energetic frequency, meanwhile ostracizing the other side. This is the crazy situation. It's the crazy situation. So partly, for anyone listening, if we do decide to share this, the process here has to be understood as coming along in participation in a whole-making process, at least for the couple hours you'll be with us. The fact that the words are coming one after another, that's a limitation. The hope is, to the degree that we can also share a kind of resonance and a sense of what's possible and a commitment to being in relation, then we can begin to paint metaphor and, in a sense, a promise to time that various things will return and there will be opportunity to integrate and contextualize that which might sound bluntly orthogonal or intersecting in some challenging way, frictionful way. But then on the other hand, fuck it, you know? Disclaimer, all I basically just did was, condense the disclaimer in the very saying that I will not be giving too many disclaimers. Nevertheless, if we just had a word for that and we could all trust it, like a safe word, then maybe we could really begin to have some conversations as a culture. But then could that just not be abused? That takes us in a different direction in some critical sense. Anyway, so to wind it back and just for my adding something in here in terms of pinpointing an energy that I was glad to see come through in some of the material that we discussed, was just that sense of the imminent reality of real violence and its consequence, and how and also how that is so deeply in our nature, and that a space seeking justice that is wanting that is not opening itself up to a proper relation with that dynamic, a proper remembrance of that dynamic, I think is completely doomed in being able to see or share in perspective together. It is in its own sense collapsing into its own view, in the same way that that which is totally back up against the wall, last resort only, isn't interesting in any other perspectives either. There's something paradoxical about that. And, well, maybe it's futile to even wish for in the context of public discourse. I genuinely don't know. I don't know about that. Is it possible to be with the real of what's happening in this type of conflict publicly? Genuine question for me. Hey, maybe I've been totally naive. Maybe at the end of the day, it's always about what happens behind closed doors, and it's always about puppetry on stage. I'm not saying I think so. Certainly, I'm not in the movement of pledging myself to that. I'm, in fact, on the opposite position to that. But nevertheless, and let's not be naive about the challenge of really having a conversation about this, because at the end of the day, it does cash out in a rather, to strip away all the emotion with the language of cash. It kind of cashes out in a, well then, what would you do in this situation? Would you pull the trigger? Is Netanyahu a war criminal, or is he protecting his people? Now, in his case, there's a lot of complexity. Nevertheless, there is, as Jacob put in his article, we could think about this in terms of, if we're to think about this in terms of what is appropriate response, then let's open ourselves up ultimately to the necessity, the reality of violence. The reality of violence. And if anybody wants to make a case for the necessity of violence, I think that's a very interesting philosophical case to make. And also, let's make space and remember something deeper within us that hopes for another way, that hopes toward the sharing in a more loving world, where such things as justice might just that little bit more reveal themselves in a manner that supports the flourishing and becoming of children on this earth, eh? So, all right. So why come along to this, those of you who haven't heard of? What interests you to come along?
You kind of hit the nail on the head with your last question there, which is like, what would you have done, right? And like, or what should they have done, I think is the question at hand, right? Because like we can get so lost in moralizing and saying like who is right and who is wrong But the question is, what should they have done in that situation, right? And I think that, like, when I look at it, it's hard for me to say that either side should have done differently, right? Going back all the way to, like, you could say the Jews came over from Europe and stole the land from the Palestinians or the Arabs or whatever identity you want to put in that region at that time. And that was wrong. It's like, okay, but what should they have done? Stay in Europe and get just genocided by the Europeans? No, like, they're gonna, there. And this goes back all the way to, like, the story of Exodus, right? And this is, I don't know if I've brought this up before in Voicecraft, but this is something that, like, I've grappled with a lot, right? Is that in the story of Exodus, the Jews go into the promised land and commit genocide, right? And God tells them very straightforwardly, go in and kill the Canaanites and don't leave women and children, and you will inhabit land that other people developed, right? And you think, well, that's horrible, that's wrong. But then you have to ask the deeper question, which was like, what should they have done, right? Stay in Egypt and remain slaves? No, that's, you can't say they should have done that unless, I mean, I guess the Christians might, right? The Christians might say, well, slaves, submit to your masters and turn the other cheek and wait for Jesus. But that's not the Jewish way, right? And I think it's easy to empathize with the Jewish mindset of, like, no, the Jews were slaves in Egypt. They were being oppressed and persecuted, and they wanted freedom. And so they escaped from Egypt. But now they're in the desert and they're surrounded by hostile people who won't let them pass, right? And so now what should they do? Just stay in the desert and die, return to Egypt and be slaves? No, they're going to go and conquer a land that is not theirs. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but what should they have done in that situation, right, is the relevant question. And so it's the same thing in the modern context. Like, it's hard to say that the Jews should have just stayed in Europe and allowed themselves to be persecuted to death. And so, like, there's the whole myth of the people without or the land without a people. Like, there was no land without a people. People had spread across all the land at that point, right? And so it's either stay in Europe and die, or go and conquer a land that's not yours, right? And so then you have to ask, okay, so how should the Palestinians have responded to that? Should they have just rolled over and allowed the Zionists to establish their state? And whether or not they were going to kick out the Palestinians is a matter of debate, but certainly they were going to impose their identity upon those people. And so should they just roll over and take that? Well, no, right? They should, it's easy to see why they should have rejected that and gone to war. And so then what should the Israelis have done? Quit their project and go back to Europe? No, right? On and on and on and on. And so, like, I think that to me, that's the first thing that has to happen if there's ever going to be any movement forward, is that both sides have to recognize that if they were in the place of the other, they probably would have done the same thing, which doesn't resolve the conflict, but it does at least create, like, a meeting ground where the other side is no longer this just monster that can't be empathized with or reasoned with. Because there's people on both sides who want to just say, well, they're just irrational and unreasonable and they just want to kill us and we just have to get rid of them, right? And I do think that recognizing that you being in their place, you probably would have done the same thing is a good start, And that was the question. Pierce Morgan actually asked this question during one of those interviews to, I can't remember her name, not Abby Martin, but another defender of the Palestinians.
Rama Zain,
thank you. He asked that question and she didn't give a response. She just said, well, the problem is that you're putting the starting point at October 7th. You should put the starting point much before that, which is how the conversation always goes, right? It's like, well, they only did that because they did this other thing. And I'm like, yeah, and you would have done the same had you been in that situation. And so I don't know. That's just kind of how I've been thinking about it. And there's that, and there's another piece, which is just like the nature of the collective, right? Like, who did it and who's responsible, and like, what does it mean to be part of a collective identity, which is kind of a whole nother topic, which I won't fully open right now, but that's what I got to say at the start.
Thank you, Zach. Aspasia, Could I ask you, if you're open to speaking at this point, can I ask you to share some of your thoughts in relation to this? And then I will totally step back and we'll just let it go to the silence from there.
I'm not sure I have much to share at this point. I've been thinking, as everyone's talking, I've been thinking about this through the frame of annihilation anxiety, but not to the point where I have anything to share yet.
And what is that?
Annihilation anxiety. It's a form of anxiety in childhood, which can become pathological, which is which can be seen later on in adulthood as the fear of losing your mind, the fear. It's essentially not having a stable ego structure. So the fear of being annihilated, a sort of a pathological form of that, generally comes about when a child experiences a situation where there is no recourse in terms of their actions. They're just stuck in a situation, and it's a fear of fear of being overwhelmed by the other, of falling apart in terms of ego structure. It relates a lot to situations of war and conflict, really being in the impossible situation where one, that's where my mind's going anyway. I've been thinking about that recently, in this so this framework's alive in my mind, and there's a lot of different directions I could take that. So I'm still not sure.
Yeah. I mean, so here's the thing. What I am most wanting to share right now, it feels like it's how much do you trust the public space? Not much, because the words that are coming to me from what you said, and this is it's hyperbolic as a question in a sense, it's provocative, but it seems so sickeningly relevant. And it's the relationship. So, okay, I'll soften it a bit. I'll say it's something to do with the relationship between innocence and corruption. Innocence and corruption in the context of unwitting participation in causation, which has the potential not only to perpetuate that very dynamic of the corruption of innocence, but also potentially the corruption of much broader threads of the ecology. But what does that mean in response? Does that mean one gets to be the annihilator of corruption? How quickly does one wish to step into those shoes? And shouldn't we not just see the too quick stepping into those shoes as being evidence, in fact, of being caught in that very mode of corruption itself, in some critical sense that one is already lost? So that really does. And I mean, yeah, where do you go in our time? In what way does our culture enable a conversation about the relationship really between innocence and corruption? Oof.
Well, none of us are innocent. Just depends upon the particular scale that you decide to make your judgments, what your rubric is. I'll jump ahead and I'll give you my end analysis of the situation, is that there is a divide between two worlds. I'll first pose as a question, from whence is the moralizing? Because the history of this world is the history of conflict and war, the strong destroying the weak over and over again. So my story 2,000 years ago would have been, obviously Israel's going to win, and that's because God wants them to win. Their God won. Duh. That's just part of the worldview. When did that change? What are you appealing to when you say be reasonable, be moral? What are we appealing to? And if you're not appealing to a shared morality, and you're trying to argue between two, I think you're going to be forever stuck in the pattern of antiquity prior to the ability to question morality, which is the scapegoat game. Okay, that's the fundamental divide here. The scapegoat game is trying to determine blame so that you could right the world through justice by destroying the thing that's causing the harm. But it's not actually the thing that's causing the harm. So we had to learn that. If we haven't learned that, we just keep playing this pattern out. No amount of moralizing or rationalizing or argumentation seems to me capable of destroying that pattern. It is a voluntary self-sacrifice an individual has to make. And in a collectivist society such as theirs, the individual feels things as the collective, and they don't make decisions as individuals. There's no way out of this. You have violence, or you give up the scapegoat mechanism. That's it. So you have violence or you have Christ. Symbolically speaking, I'm not trying to baptize the infidels. It's so ridiculous. The problem is definitely somewhere between our need, if I go into a metaphorical, metaphysical space or an abstract conceptual one, it's the convergence of blame, which is the need to point a singular figure out, which is the scapegoat mechanism. It's collapsing, versus the creative divergence of being able to explore other alternatives of what might be a future where we don't have to kill each other. And that's the thing I don't see happening. A profound explosion of innovation and expenditure of capital, attention, time, intelligence, wisdom, swarming the area. That's not happening. So it hasn't been happening for decades and decades. And all the people that are suddenly worried about this, I'm sorry. It's not going to be solved through podcasts. And it's going to come to us very soon. I hope everyone knows that. The spirit doesn't go away. It spreads.
Well, those
So
things seem to be in contradiction a little bit. Not going to be solved by podcasts and then speaking about it coming to us. And here we are in relation with each other. So like,
we've got to
open
Those are
that.
two separate things. Yeah. No. A prophylactic. Yeah, perhaps I was not intending to say that there is no good taking place here. I'm saying the situation itself isn't going to be resolved in podcasts. I'm not referring to this one in particular.
Yeah, but this has to be made clear because people continue to make this point, and the thing is that people aren't used. They're not actually familiar with what it is to really participate in bringing oneself to interaction, in bringing oneself to transformative understanding, in bringing oneself to a place of conscious deliberation, of real reception, of real receptivity. You know, and because we can meme podcasts, but at the end of the day, all that is well, I won't go to, but it's really important to zoom in there, because if we take away the transformative power of at least gathering together sometimes to exchange, then it's all just so performatively in contradiction that I don't know where this as an interaction goes.
Yeah. So like I said, when I'm gesturing towards podcast, it's that nemosphere, which is the argumentation portion of who's right or wrong in this story, right? That's what I'm referring to, not this. I wouldn't be here for that, right? So what can't be expected is an assignation of blame. When you're living in that expectation, it seems even the willful submission to it gives that spirit a certain power, which ultimately ends in corruption. I reference only the amount of money that actually gets sent to Gaza each year. Do you know how many billions of dollars get sent to the Gazans each year? Where does that money go? It's not good enough, right? Like yeah. So I think prophylaxis, because I don't actually have any optimism for a sudden flood of innovation and resources into the area to grant the basic human necessities to each family. It's not even really what they look for. It's not really what the whole argumentation's about. But that is generally what would cause people to be less violent. Enormous part of it is the constant stress of that life. I mean, you know how you pick up stress from people around you, right? When you're having a hard day. Imagine a hard life, the whole life. No sense of any hope. And then everything that you hear is a blame game. The whole narrative is a vengeance story that's older than time. Now, we're in that lineage, by the way. We are of these people. Why are we doing this differently? How can you offer that? Sorry, that's mine. No, Tim, this is a great discussion to have. This is not worthless.
Yes, and just to be clear, I definitely also wouldn't be arguing that all it takes is conversation. I'm definitely not trying to come from it from that side either. It's
I'm speaking somewhat to the source material, right? So what Piers Morgan and his ilk do is they say, look, if we can just have a conversation, right? If we can let's just be civil and have a conversation. And the reason they're doing that is because it's generating the field of potential for attention. But the outcome is almost always the same. It's just yelling and name calling, and the feminine compassion that was attempting to be held in that space was immediately denied by her when she played the reputation game and attacked him. And that's what, if you look, when she claimed that he was only there to make money off of it, that's when he reacted, right? It's classic.
Let me zoom in on this just for the sake of, if we do share this, those listening. What Tyler's referencing is the conversation between Rama Zain and Musab Hassan Yusuf, which was the principal inspiration for me gathering together again. We've obviously spoken about this before, and we would have doubtless again, but in large part I agree with the point you're making, Tyler, in terms of the repetition of the same sorts of dynamics we're seeing take place in the public justification space. Do you condemn this? Do you condemn that? Who's to blame, right? But this one, to me, it felt like you can sense a glimmer of an energy present, opened up to some sort of potential. I'm not saying that was realized, but it did feel to have something distinct about it. And well, it generated more attention than some of the other, pieces that he's published on that channel, I think, for that reason. And so I'm curious if anybody has any reflections about that dynamic in particular. It didn't seem to me to be actually safe for her to be more vulnerable in care for him. Again, Musab. But she is pretty much the only one I've seen from that, let's say, progressive, pro-Palestinian media position that seemed to me that was undergoing an encounter with a particular kind of energy where she didn't immediately collapse into justification to push it to the side or to re-box it. Now, I agree that she did do a little bit of that once it continued to unfold. But there's this moment of a kind of aporia of actually, I want to be in care for the values, the energy, the reality that's expressing itself through this man, in a sense, right? There's something I actually want to, if I'm here on behalf of compassion, let's say that's roughly what she's trying to be, is have compassion for the Palestinians too, right? Then I actually do, in fact, want to be here with compassion for the totality. That there's some, the energy, which it seemed to be like a truth in there. It seemed to be a kind of, there was something there that was a momentary opening. Now, of course, nothing really became of that. You know, in the second conversation with Abby Martin, you know, she's very much prepared and was just basically like, you're an Israeli spy, you know, whatever, basically. All the rest of it, I'm sorry about your childhood, sorry about the trauma and the rape and the ostracization from your people and whatever, the fact that you know, allegedly worked to stop suicide bombers from killing innocent people, kind of whatever. You're a spy for Israel. Israel is what it is. They're the Zionists. Therefore, everything you have to say is just whatever now. Sad case, but sorry. So I'm curious if anyone has any reflection on, if anybody else picks up on this type of dynamic, like what impressed you as real about it. You know, part of the provocation for this was, this felt slightly more real to me, but what does that mean?
There's a distinction in my mind between, there was a moment in that first conversation where the reference that she made to him was more about acknowledging his psychodynamics, like acknowledging the impact on his psychodynamics. It was something, I can't remember now, but it was something to do with like the potential motivations based on who his father was, and like it was more psychodynamically oriented. And there was also just a manner to her tone and the way she said it that felt to have some more care integrated into it, versus that second example you're describing, which is really just a pointing to events that you went through. Like, I'm very sorry about these sort of events. Whereas I think that first one, perhaps maybe part of what you're registering as being different, is that it was maybe an attempt to try and meet him at a deeper level, or a more human kind of level. It was subtle. It's a very subtle distinction. But that was actually a comment. I should have written it down. That was a comment that stuck with me. And I wish I could remember exactly what it was. But from my memory, it was more of a reference to a compassion for how he may be being motivated currently, as a and based on also like the father-son dynamic, and I just think that shows to me a more sort of maybe genuine, individualized focus. Some people could argue maybe that's just an attempt as well to be smart and to try and undo him. But that's very different to me versus that sort of second version you're describing, where someone's just pointing out a whole lot of stuff someone experienced, and it's like actual events. So sorry for all these events, as opposed to what he may be experiencing about the relationship with his father on those sort of deeper, more unconscious levels. That to me really stood out.
I'd be curious to watch this with you guys and see like where you would point out you were feeling that. Because I didn't get any of the genuineness that you seem to have felt.
Israel is fighting for its very existence. And I am also fighting for my very existence. When there are people out there who want you to cease to exist, this is when they push you to the corner and you have no other choice but to fight. I'm in the same position. How it feels like when you have hundreds of millions of people who sentenced you to death because of false narratives.
Mr. Hassan, I truly do apologize that your type of relationship with your father has led you to this quest to condone the annihilation of your own people. I truly am sorry for that. But just as you said, it is not about you. Unfortunately, what we're seeing today and how we're seeing it, it is bigger and it is older than Hamas.
What do you say to that charge that somehow you're driven by that more than anything else?
Well, it is not only personal, it's fundamental. What I did during the Second Palestinian Intifada, I risked my life on a regular basis to save human lives from Hamas' brutal suicide bombing attacks. Our job was to stop Hamas from blowing up things. Buses, markets, beaches, beach houses, they targeted everywhere. Hamas' strategy of using civilians or targeting civilians is not a new thing. Now, for me to be sentenced to death for saving a human life because there is a belief system that says so, well, I totally reject that. And they want me to cease to exist. This is not a relationship between father and son. And by the way, I don't need your pity. My relationship with my father was an excellent relationship. I loved my father and he loved me. I'm sure he still does love me. But this is where we draw the line. When the higher interest of humanity is at risk, when people kill hundreds and thousands of civilians by the name of religion and by the name of ideology, somebody has to stand up.
The slaughter of children is wrong. The siege is wrong. Abducting people for liking posts in other parts of Palestine is wrong. 7th of October did not happen in a vacuum. Another bigger problem is that you've had lies being regurgitated by officials from the 7th of October. It doesn't end up being a debate. It ends up being that I'm trying to convince you that Palestinian life is worth it. The videos that we are having to watch daily now of families trapped under rubble. In what world is it normal for a mother to go get aid and come back to find that her house has been flattened, that her family has been slaughtered? How are you justifying what you are justifying when a son finds out that his father has been killed so easily?
Let me ask you what he has to say. Mossab, your response to that?
Very important to understand the origin of suffering. And the cycle of violence is a very long, vicious cycle of violence. And I think the root cause of this is the false narrative and the victim narrative. Instead of taking responsibility, we blame everybody. The suffering of the Gazans, do you think you are the only ones who see the suffering of the Gazans? You are not the only one.
And the West
But
Bank
in war, people suffer.
Palestine. Please, sir.
I am from the West Bank. This is my birthplace, and I know what's going on
Then
there, and I know
think you
all the
ought to
con
discuss that
artists
as
who
well.
have been hijacking generation after generation. They don't care for the children. They don't care for humanity. Their game is for power and money. This is what they do.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think there's any expectation of anything to occur there. The whole framing itself, here's show. He's sitting, he's sitting in a studio. When that interview ended, he went on to the next interview with the next and said the exact same things. You can find all his interviews, they're all out there. It's just, I mean, he does work for Mossad. He does work for the Israeli government. He is out there to push a certain narrative. If either one of them were to give in to a center ground, they would be seen to be appeasing. Okay. And he's in strict orders not to do anything like that, I'm sure. And there's no way that she could live that down. People in her camp.
100%. But that's why the reason why I think that one became more watched than others is because despite all of that, there was just a glimmer of genuine aporia. Just a glimmer of genuine aporia. And I wonder, now look, I'm not here to defend Piers Morgan, okay? Like I would gladly, Tyler, you know, if you wanted to give a 5-minute refutation of the quality and authenticity of that program, I'm here and all for it. It doesn't need to be made. But I wonder though. Okay, so here's something speculative. I wonder about the energy it takes to maintain a steady state of division. You might say it takes a certain amount of energy, settles into its own little attractor dynamic, and maybe when you approach some threshold or some membrane or some possibility of encounter, the energy and the tension of it might increase. And there's all these pressures, as you're kind of saying, to, you know, well, you're here to do a job, right? You're here to champion this particular cause, this particular view. And so all the energy is pointing that way. And I wonder, from the perspective of the audience watching, people find themselves caught up in these patterns all the time. You want to be on the right side of history or the wrong side of history, and depending on which camp you're part of, they're completely different sides of history. My sense, I wonder if, I'm curious about the energetic dynamics of maintaining that very tension itself. And I wonder about the desire or hope for the possibility. Okay, so this is silly. This is silly in a sense, but in a deep sort of psychodynamic way, maybe not so. So my parents divorced. And for a long time, energetically, I was very much there in hope that they might just be able to talk to each other. You know, that would have felt like, in a sense, the truth and the goodness of my world being stitched back together. And the point I'm kind of making is that the pain of that division is maybe suboptimal. You might say appropriately tragic in some deeper sense of ensoulment or developmental becoming with respect to the brokenness of our world and the necessity of metabolizing that and finitude and various things, right? We could deepen this in a number of ways. But I wonder about that which energetically seeks a kind of reunion. And I wonder about, therefore, the kind of service that can be done, even in the most toxic and corrupt of discourse spaces. It seems to me the layer of that justification for previously established identities at the political level, I do wonder about the possibility for a reattunement, a kind of the possibility for an encounter and an openness to an energy of the possibility for reciprocity, i.e. a deeper basis in commons participation, right? That seems to be there in the pulse and in the Jesus Christ, in the evolving, unfolding telos of being, in some critical sense. And if not that, then it is in some sense violence and competition all the way down. But even then, that violence and competition, for what? Is it not bound in some sense by some possibility of, again, I'm not arguing for a fixed and static unity, but the energy towards the whole making, the energy towards the reunification with justice or the image of the good, that can be corrupted and misled in all of these ways. And yet the point I'm making with respect to the possibility for there to be positive value, not only for sort of anthropologic kind of sociological analysis reasons or something like the Piers Morgan show, but that even in the most ridiculous of discourse contexts, that there's something about the possibility for an energetic meeting and like a coming together of energy that can reveal a possibility for the kind of aporia, with kind of an opening toward possibility that is transcendent of what we clamp down on as those political divides. And it would seem to me that something like there's a longing for that energy. I think there's a longing for the presentation in that sense of a sourced authority of genuine authorship, which in that sense isn't coming from the fixed political identity of what the author has to author because it's been scripted by his power block, but because there's something that's coming through from a deeper sourcing, and that the witnessing of the possibility of that has a kind of power, if you like, that is forever destabilizing, but through that also potentiating of the possibility for some kind of, again, I don't like the word unity here or reunion or something like that because it sounds flippant and utopian and these types of things. I just mean, that's why I like the kind of the whole making, but something towards that way. And I'm resisting, obviously, part of my psyche is resisting capping that off because not here to preach, but somewhere in there's the hope.
Pardon me, Tim. I really want to add something in here. First, I feel a deep compass alignment with where you're bringing us, and that the last part of that thread, really, I felt that was pretty biblical kind of spirit coming through. But there are some particulars to the situation, especially of this gentleman, that I want to introduce that, due to the absolute particulars of my life course, I know a great deal about. I've spent a lot of time in relationship with people who are ex-Muslim. I was also really quite ideologically seduced and attracted to the ex-Muslim liberal thinker Maajid Nawaz when I was a younger man in university, and I met him a number of times and was kind of part of that milieu. And in the context of that, what I found is that for many people, not just the ones who become these really intense voices in criticism of Islam, but anyone who defects from Islam experiences a trauma. Defection from Islam is a trauma, and I would assert that as a truth, as an experiential truth, and also one that gets played around with. Because in the inverse, when you're inside of Muslim community and you look to ex-Muslims, often the narrative is, well, it was because they had bad parents or they had a bad upbringing, or it was something about their personal context, not the collective religious body of which they were a part. So the price of defection from Islam is enormously high. And so anybody who actually has a life sufficiently intense to motivate them to take that leap, like they're already a very particular set of people who've come from really intense conditions. Most people who defect will try to disappear and stay quiet. It's only a particularly charged group, and many of the people in that group, that charge has to be understood as a mixture of true information about their experience that has to be integrated, and trauma about their situation, which is not integrated in their expressing of what they've experienced necessarily, because they're still in the trauma. They haven't, like, the reconciliation you're talking about for someone like him or anyone who's defecting from Islam is like, how can you even have hope in that context? It seems like such a stubborn possibility that the community you have come from will recognize your humanity and goodness, independent of submitting to it, of participating with it. You are an enemy. You are a defector. You are an underminer of the ultimate truth. So we have to be careful and thoughtful, not just about this gentleman, but in general. Those voices are enormously seductive, enormously intense, come from really, really hardcore life experiences. And I think the potential, the high potential of a space like Voicecraft, what this points to is to actually begin to situate a person like that in such a way that we could begin to pass out the truth of their experience, whilst noticing when that actual darkness is kind of manifesting and coming outwards from them. The pain that they're holding is coming out and being put on too. And so often they'll be quite dogmatic in opposition to Islam, and sometimes without important nuance.
Yeah, very well said. And that's super important. I'm glad you've brought that in. Yes, so I'm going to hold for the time being, just say thank you for that. Very much agree. I'm curious to hear from Tom, Kyle, Cam, how you're sort of metabolizing this. If you feel anything calling in terms of something unspoken for, something that we might be able to move in the direction of, address in some sense. return to. Yeah, I'm curious what's coming through for you.
Say one of the things that comes up for me is circling back to the beginning, Zach, when you were using the word should. I really liked everything you were saying. I felt in alignment with everything you were sharing. So what I'm about to say now, what I want to presence is there seems to be some larger evolution of consciousness. At least that's how it appears to me from my perspective here, looking back over the last however many thousands of years. And so what I don't want to do is have the fallacy of saying like, oh, just because we could do it now means we could have done it 2,000 years ago. And I do feel now, from my current perspective, there is a unique opportunity for humanity to collectively make higher choices. And I'm going to say really specifically what I mean by that. Because the thing I liked what you also said, Zach, was it seems to be this emphasis on morality and should. Why did I call it shoulding? Like people get really into shoulding. Oh, you should do this. You should do this. You should do this. And that whole way of thinking, that whole way of relating to reality and other people will take you off of your knowing, and it will take you off of high choices a lot of the times. Like shoulding on someone else is inherently, from my perspective, either a neutral or a low choice. And what I mean by that is nothing to do with morality. It's not saying high choices are better. It's more like at an energetic level, at a level of consciousness, high choices will uplift your consciousness. Low choices will take you down and they'll spiral in on themselves. And that to me, and this is partly what I got from listening to Tyler as well, to kind of bring what he was sharing, there's a dynamic at play that's underneath everything that's being said. And there's so many ways to language it, but how I would language it is like, what you put in darkness will call you into that darkness. And the only way to step past that is to stop fighting darkness, to stop putting anything in darkness. Because the second you do that, you're going to be pulling yourself down into it, whether you want to or not. And that to me is a shift from fighting darkness to illumination. And for
Kyle,
me, the way you do that, please cut me off at any point.
Yeah, no, I'm curious. Could you try and land that in the context of the Israel-Palestine and what you mean by that for me? Because I'm enjoying what you're saying.
Yeah, no, perfect. Okay, that's where I was going to try to. Now I set that up. So to land that into the Palestine, one of the things that really stood out to me in that first conversation was on the show that we're talking about, is that when Morgan asked her, well, what should they have done? Like, how should Israel have responded? And he was just like drilling into her like hard. And she was answering, and she would talk for like 30 seconds. He would kind of like interject. He's like, well, answer the question. Answer, like, what should they have done? She's like, I'm trying to answer the question. If you'll just let me respond how I want to respond. And then she would start talking, and like 20 seconds in, he would like cut back in. I could tell she was getting really frustrated. And so for me, when you say like, oh, what should they have done? There's more of a emphasis on that in terms of physical response. And so instead of me saying what they should have done in terms of like a literal response in the world, it's like, from my perspective, I would say, well, the one thing you don't want to do is to put anything or anyone else, individual or collectively, in darkness. You don't want to judge them. You don't want to blame them. You can speak with discernment about what's happening and collectively discuss without fear in these responses and say, like, oh no, like, because we know anything else is going to pull us into that. It's going to pull us down. And the only thing that actually moves past war, the only chance humanity has to move past war, is a level of consciousness that does not adhere to war. It's just not coherent with it. And to reach that consciousness that's not coherent with war requires consistent high choices, which is not judgment, it's not blame, it's not shooting other people. And that to me is kind of where I land on that response.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. So there's many things I'm drawn to respond there. For the sake of the whole, one really interesting question for me, and I think this is a savage question, and it's interesting. It's a savage question. I'm using that word perhaps because maybe in your languaging, I'm indicating that I might be potentially presenting, you might argue I'm going to potentially present a false dichotomy where the only things that exist are low choices, which would be interesting. But nevertheless, I think from the perspective of many of the even moderately pro-Israel camp in terms of the necessity of getting as close to eradicating Hamas, notwithstanding whether or not, in fact, all you're doing is just creating more of that same issue. So how far? You're going to kill everyone? You're going to displace everyone? I'm not trying to take us down that road, although that might be indicative of some of the poor quality of, let's say, thinking. But someone could just as well argue, well, it's just a savage reality of there are no alternatives, and maybe this is something. But my point is that it seems to me that in the philosophies of, again, the more pro-Israel position, that there is a resignation to now again, judgment or discernment, a resignation, but I'm going to say to the judgment that there is no alternative. It's not possible to mutually participate in a higher kind of choice, because there's such a values mismatch, and sort of we find ourselves at the tail end, maybe they might argue, of a process which in that sense has already had all of these causal movements, that we're sort of at the end of the road, and actually there's no redemption for this subsection of people. You could zoom in. Most people agree that, well, yeah, Hamas have to be stopped because, having in the charter or whatever else that, we're for the annihilation of Israel. And hey, look, what we plan to do on October 7, well, they're just going to do that again and again. They're telling you they're going to do it. Make arguments about their religious convictions, loving death more than life. People make these kinds of actions. Well, here we have a case of a group of people who simply cannot be met at the table of mutual discernment. Therefore, maybe you're saying something interesting or valuable about the kind of higher choices that we might want to make, but let's just start that tomorrow once we've washed our hands with this, because that for sure can't participate. Do you know what I mean? But nevertheless, there's a calculation of, even if we say, do we have the energy? Now, if we go, do we have the energy to enter into what that process might look like, and what consequences, what costs are we willing to pay? What sacrifices, this is the kind of point I made at the beginning in gesture, what sacrifices are we willing to make in order to live the possibility of a dream where our children don't grow up wanting to kill each other? Well, someone will say, well, actually, look over there, they're teaching their kids to grow up wanting to kill us. And someone will go, well, have you checked out who's in Netanyahu's cabinet? And there's plenty of more radicalized Zionists who are part of the political context of Israel, and they don't have the highest opinion of Arabs or Islam in general either, in ways that might in their own way be just as incommensurate with the kind of evolution, like the moment of values that we might hope exists more in the context of the modern West or in the modern day. This contrast again between medieval value systems, Tyler's kind of making this point, and the modern day. Not to say that, not again trying to put where we are on too much of a pedestal, and yet I think we can point to clear things that have been done better. So yeah, so somewhere in there is kind of where I think is moves us into a very interesting place of challenge, because I actually connect very strongly with the perspective you're sharing, but I also recognize this aspect of decision making that sums up a situation and goes, energetically, it's not possible to be in relation with you. I can't trust that. Therefore, I'm going to take what steps I can to alter that situation, and then seek to enter participation with others where it might be possible to have more of a mutual process of discernment and choice making together. And in there is where the devil really is. And there is the point at which I think the more abstracted we are from the actual context, the more absurd and ridiculous the whole possibility of conversation is. And so I think we definitely need to emphasize that, extremely, so strongly that actually I will just stop talking right now, and nevertheless still point to this dynamic,
I do have something I could say in response, but I know Tom and Cam, you haven't had a chance to speak. So if there's anything you want to kind of bring in, I'm happy to create the space for that.
Go for it if you want, Kyle.
I see Cam nodding head. I think it's pretty brief. And I like what you said there, Tim. I would say like a really important nuance that I maybe missed in what I was saying, and kind of what I was hearing you point to, which I'm glad you brought in, which is there's this like, oh, how would we come together and like make high choices together between these polarized groups? And then there's, oh, like individually, like within myself, how do I make high choices? And a core part of that is, how are you perceiving the other person, the other soul? Is it, oh, like, to just cut to the core of it for me, and this is just my perspective on evil, there's a conflation to me that's so common in our culture, but when talking about evil or the other side, which is like, oh, that being is evil versus their intention is evil. And we just seem to not be able to really tease those apart. And so I think there is a way of being in response that's a high choice that actually has nothing to do with the other side and what they're doing. And it's like, oh, is this just a confused soul who's got wrapped up in some ideology that's now so dangerous that with love in my heart, and I'm not going to say like that being's evil, but yeah, it might require, which is kind of what I hear you point to, like it might require some force, minimum necessary force in response to maintain our collective sovereignty. But we're doing that from a place of genuine love and not intending to cause unnecessary harm, and doing our best to not do that. There's like a whole way of relating to like a war or anything like that, that to me can maintain a high level of consciousness and still protect yourself.
This all goes back to annihilation anxiety, what I'm hearing now. So this is wonderful. And I think what I'm hearing you say, Kyle, is really it's about integrated love and hate. Choices coming from a place of integrated loving and hating feelings, as opposed to going to the helpless position. And I guess outside of an individual or an intrapsychic, when you're looking at groups, a helpless position may be, well, we just can't relate anymore with these people, and they're sort of shifting away. That there's a tendency towards either going helpless or then splitting into hyperaggression. That's what happens at the individual level with annihilation anxiety, and really underneath it, it's how can you integrate the feelings of love and hate? And for the individual, they never get the opportunity to learn that. But I'm just thinking about that in this broader group situation that we're describing and linking it to what Kyle said. But I know Jacob wanted to say something too. So.
Yeah, thank you. Really important to get that sense of the higher idea, as you put it, and then how that can be rooted down into the violent reality. And rooting it in a more local and personal instance, like if you were to deal with somebody who you want to treat in love, but also has that propensity or possibility to violate your integrity because of what they're adhering to, you have to both be loving and very, very aware, very intimately in confrontation, being with the front of and the reality of what's there in a wholesome posture. And I would suggest that, yeah, this is tricky. This is tricky. I think the indications from globalization and the philosophy of Teilhard de Chardin, and my general impression throughout my fascination and feeling of responsibility to try and understand this problem was that we don't have the choice to go in other corners of the room or play in a different playground. We're all in the same playground more and more. The information sphere means that we are so much more connected. The globalization means that we're neighbors with radically different worldviews. And so for me, there's a really interesting balance. I've, by strange circumstances, ending up having a couple of friends who are Muslim in the last few years in a way that just emerged very organically and was totally unrelated to my theretofore fascination with these questions. It was actually through music and music production, and that was the shared basis of the relationship. And in that context, what I found is, because I've been on this journey in relationship to God and through plant medicine and so on, I have some degree of shared basis now that I didn't have when I was an atheist liberal. I can at least have the basis of, okay, I'm trying to serve God, you're trying to serve God. Let's try and feel into a shared appreciation. And it's a very, very enormously tricky dialogue because you have these presuppositions held on either side that are, especially on the Islamic side, really, really strongly adhered to. And we can feel the presence of that when we go to engage in interfaith, intercultural dialogue. And it's very difficult to kind of loosen that up and get to a place of normal relationship. Although, of course, lots of people work alongside people of other faiths, and the corporate context allows them to just kind of ignore all the differences. It's another thing entirely to form a friendship and love, appreciation of the other person's humanity and fullness, and at the same time hold that understanding that, given everything I know, there is a set of conditions in which this person's relationship to that collectivity may lead to them actually becoming my enemy and in opposition to my heart-held values, in a way that I actually have to put my hand out very firmly and say, no, not here. And that's a really, really interesting balance to hold, and one that I've kind of been gifted a strange opportunity to hold in that relationship. But I think that kind of speaks to the heart of it, and there's a really interesting human psychological maturity required to like appreciate somebody and parlay with them and try and create context for them, and perhaps at the highest possibility of unity, come to a shared appreciation of beauty. And I recently had an interfaith dialogue on Sense Space with Thomas Jockin from OG Rose, and we were trying to approach this very question, and where we got to was that beauty may be the one and only entry point into a conversation between Islam and the West, which I believe in a significant way ultimately underlies a lot of the problem in relating to Israel-Palestine with integrity. Like that issue can't be avoided in properly engaging.
Yeah, I think the orientation towards beauty is a really important move to make. I also really appreciate the invocation of the word confrontation. That relationship between confrontation and surrender is really central for me. And more and more the conditions enabling of the receptivity, the strengthening of the receptivity to appreciate beauty, to, appreciate anything. That seems to be really, really key. And about the other thing that's it's close to the pulse of, again, what feels like necessity for me to speak to is just the subtle and not so subtle influence of the collective overtone, the energy for potential exchange on social media. But that social media bleeds into, I think, our perception of the whole cultural relational field, work opportunities, various things. I'm talking across all platforms, not just your Twitters, but also your LinkedIns and various things, where the incessant, the energy of absolutism, like right side of history energy, relating to that, like relating to the, oh yeah, like obviously I'm the just one, I'm the compassionate one in this case, I'm the serious one, hey, as well. There's something about the mode of presentation, and again, as a kind of, it's the signaling, the effect of the signaling of virtue on the possibility to actually receive the virtues and the values of others. That's super interesting to me. I'm super interested in that philosophically. I always used to think about, in philosophy university, the notion of rhetoric, at least as I was educated, and this isn't the only way to hold this, but was often thought about in terms of the attitude and exemplification of the sophists that Socrates was in dialogue with. I believe John talks about the sophists as essentially being able to, conjure all salience, but without any relevance. And so in that sense, just bullshitting. And it turns out, maybe Socrates will walk them through whether it's a logical principle or some other organization of philosophy to reveal maybe the lack of relevance in what they're speaking about, whether the contradiction of it or something. And so I thought, okay, well, rhetoric, when I was younger, I think rhetoric is this thing, it's just this thing over the top where you're trying to maybe seduce or coerce or manipulate someone into just agreeing with you, going along with you. But because it's in a sense not grounded in the bringing forth of something more integrated, a more, let's say, truthful, and perhaps therefore also beautiful performance, something integrated in that sense, then, well, we don't want to be doing that thing, don't want to be doing that rhetoric thing. And so I've been writing and for more and more, this project has been kind of finding its, for me at least, finding its part of its center in the necessity of poetry to philosophy. And of course, many people speak about this, and we've spoken about it a lot. What does it mean to participate in authorship in a very deep sense? What does it mean to bring forth what is valued, speak forth value in a context and logic, actually, in a manner that enables an appropriate signaling of that? And it's because otherwise, how else are we? If part of philosophy is staying in the process of contact, staying in the process of dialogue, dialectic, then there's something about the way in which we presence even the very best of our opinion, particularly, I'm speaking particularly in charged contexts, although you can see it at all scales. It's, and everybody, of course, talks about the issues with virtue signaling, but the actual art or craft of speaking and sharing virtue that seems to be just so incredibly important, because we seem to reliably disable and cut off the possibility for the genuine reception of what we have to say by those who in principle we're most desiring to connect with. Though of course it's not. It's often just in-group signaling. But if we want to try and signal across contexts, we want to try and signal trans-contextually, these types of things, then what does it mean to actually present, and how can we better value in the attentional contexts and endeavors which are trying to share in a signal of participation in the reception of value, the expression of value, and all these types of things. And again, in the second person sense. So yeah, that third person virtue signaling versus the effort to share value in relationship in a manner that can actually afford a connection and participation with that. That seems to be philosophically for me so critically on the pulse, and like so deeply shadowed in, I would say, philosophy in general, the actual praxis of it in that sense, as being central to the possibility to actually see into the theory, to actually metabolize the theory, the higher ideal or anything like this. And that's just such an interesting challenge, relating in the whole, relating to the total context of signaling. Again, this relationship between justice and justification, you know.
Look, I do think that beauty will save the world. I'm fully convinced of that. It's one of the few things that we agree on, kind of ubiquitously. There's disagreement, but we can find always agreement in the beautiful. And not so with the good, and definitely not with the true. Look, the mystics can get along just fine. Sufis and the Kabbalists, and there's not that many Christian mystics, but there's a few of us. We can get along just fine. But that presupposes that spiritual dimension of believing that your individual choice has some bearing, right, on an outcome of some kind. And if you don't have that belief, then you're fully embedded within the material world. And if you're embedded in a material world in a collectivist sense, there's no expectation that any given individual can suddenly arise to the belief that they can deviate from that norm and then acquire some better position. The obtaining of a better position has to coincide with that belief that your own individual actions diverging from what is the norm can affect that outcome. Otherwise, why do it? So that comes about when we have that shared relational field of belief system. Right? And that's embedded in a material world where there's some sense that your purposeful, individual, voluntary action can improve your circumstance, which is a pretty new thing. And it's definitely an aspect of the economic, socio-political layer that's been cultivated in the West, that's at war with this prior way of seeing things. Now, it's not to say that this is somehow a perfectly benevolent improvement on the circumstance. The empire engine of the United States of America has an enormous fault in all of this stuff that's happening right now. There are people embedded within the governance mechanisms of my country, which I know are complicit in enormous global sins, scales I can't even comprehend. That has nothing to do with me, nor what I would desire, nor what the vast majority of my countrymen would desire if you were to ask us, countrywomen, and country, whatever people want to call themselves. Okay, like this, I am grateful for the fact that I got born into a worldview and a set of circumstances where my own personal ire hasn't risen to the felt sense that I need to destroy anyone's life next to mine. It's a profound gift. Usually even that gets turned into something that fuels more war, because that in American can become the phrase something like, I support my soldiers and my countrymen because they bought me my freedom with their lives, as though somehow that is actually the actuality of things, right? That the war itself is what gave us our freedom. There's so much power and truth in that. It's an undeniable one. It's what our history is full of. But that doesn't mean that's what we have to play out. So,
yeah. Well, thank you, Tyler. There's something in there which I think is really important. I mean, for me, really important to zoom in on, which is something like the recognition of genuine privilege and actually being able to receive that as a gift and to do something with that, to make good on that gift, make good on the promise of that, or the potential of that, rather. And that's a point you made earlier on in terms of an attitude towards creating. And, there's always a question of like, well, what's the point in talking about this when there's not much influence, or at all, so far removed? When I was preparing and thinking, when we held an event in the local context here at the end of last year on war and unity, part of my sense was, well, this is actually a profound opportunity to come together and actually find great enthusiasm in the possibility for doing something other than war. Like, let's not do war. Isn't that the best way we can actually help in some critical sense? So anyway, which is not to say there's nothing relevant or important about political action, and that's potentially one point in this conversation where there's a little bit of a slight omission, which is, I think there are times for political activism. Maybe we can have a session on that at some point. It'd be about time we brought in some political activists, I would say, into the context of Voicecraft. So anyway, we've been speaking for a little while here, and as we move towards closing, I just want to offer some space for whoever feels called to share in bringing things to at least a temporary close. Jacob, I know you have a hard stop, so perhaps if you have something to share, we can begin with you. And I'm curious, Cam, if you have any thoughts to share in closing as well, and then we'll open it up.
In this moment, I'm actually feeling pretty open. I don't feel like that sense of intensity, like a degree of really grounding passion in the course of this dialogue has been really necessary. But through the process of meeting each other, in the process of grounding that energy authentically, there is release of some of the psychic tension that is wrapped around this thing. And insofar as this growth and expansion of conscious spaces of dialogue and communion, in which there is an attempt to go so deep within ourselves that we are actually attempting to process things which are beyond ourselves, beyond our individuality, and we're processing the collective through somatic methods, through philosophy, and through mind. That's a humble beginning to what bringing medicine to this can look like. And I do believe that there's fundamental unity. I do believe there's connection. I do believe there's degrees of causality between us and the thing to which we are responding, even with all of its locality. And we have a profound privilege, gift, freedom, and possibility to think and act and organize ourselves freely based upon an impulse of love and common soul in the West that no other society has the potential for right now. Where we cut off the boundaries of where is that free world and where does it end, that's also a whole other conversation. And of course, this isn't ultimately occurring just within the West in relation to other blocks. It's the freedom of mind that we're calling forth for all human beings. And so whenever this conversation goes to, well, what would you do if you would experience the exact same series of historical and cultural contingencies? Would you too become the barbarian within yourself or not? And whether we believe there's fundamentally a choice that even in that context, fundamentally in that context, has bearing that goes all the way up and down our theological and embodied map of reality. So that's how I would close out.
This is obviously a very complex thing to focus on, both individually and coming together like this. And that's partially because there's such a primal energy to it that I'm sure we can all relate to, but it's also we can identify different parts of ourselves that can go in different directions, I think. And that comes through when we acknowledge, I guess, the consequence of scarcity, of deprivation, of desperation, of trauma imprints, of the relationship and compensation with power there, and how intoxicating that can be as people get lost in that, how that fuses with religious ideology. The reality is, as long as people are chasing their shadows in the world, they're going to be playing incredibly finite games, which capitulates the inability to actually move beyond that game, in the sense that when you've got such a low resolution projection of shadow, which means there's an othering in a broad category context, when you can't see people as individuals, you simply see the collectivist kind of a group that someone roughly fits into. There is that neuroception of danger constantly. And your system is so overwhelmed with that which disables the capacity for choice, the capacity to play a different game, the capacity to even restore your system through sleep, that the feedback systems are not going in any direction that isn't self-annihilation. And so this fear of, this anxiety around annihilation inevitably, paradoxically, leads to annihilation, or the risk of that being just exponential, right? And people can get just so lost in this, and it's so easily to be conditioned and influenced in the context of this very primal way of functioning. And I'm sure all of us at some point have experienced what it means to just really narrow down our energetic capacity and just feel into the dyads, the schemas of what it means to feel threatened, and how that can just take hold of you if you don't actually experience a relational context and environment which enables you to actually feel safe with your vulnerability. And, so when I see this Mozab, I see absolute terror in that guy. He's been terrified, and the only recourse is to exert terror as a reaction, right? And that's the identity. And anyone who can be part of that is, oh my God, we're going to make it, right? We're going to make it against the terror. The immense suffering is, we're going to take them out. We don't have to fear that suffering coming back to us again. We can just use the power of technology and, the masculine drive for, conquering. All these kind of things can come together. And so energetically, if people are coming together to talk about this, obviously that environment with Pierre's program, it's not working energetically, it's working in this very dissonant way energetically, where you can't actually talk to someone like that without, a deeper therapeutic process. And so it does just just kind of reinforce this dynamic of opposition and adversary, whereas that's why, part of what I think is one of the few ways of getting at this is for the more esoteric domains, where people can be entering together a mode of interbeing to actually be influencing the more exoteric domains, where power and influence is actually critical to the way information and signaling and outcomes are created. or at least the way disruption to processes occurs, the way the reconditioning of possibility occurs. Because people at ground level are just not going to have that sense of, as it's been expressed here and through various different lenses and angles, they're not going to have that sense of there is another option. And, you know, if all I knew was devastation and I could, you know, just breathing every day was, you know, a miracle. If I can pick up a weapon and take someone out who I think could be going to do something terrible to my identity complex or my capacity for life, that's going to be a huge achievement, even if I die in the process. And so when people are desperate, you know, you can keep this thing going, right? People who are desperate taking each other out, you can dehumanize, you can do all these things that come with a low resolution capitulation of us versus them. But at the end of the day, if you keep chasing your shadow in the world, if you, by some miracle, manage to create the peace in your life because that has been annihilated, you're then going to have to deal with your shadow within yourself. And that is equally as traumatizing, you know, because when that sense of empathy kicks in again with the energetic circumstance enabling that, assuming you're not a full-on psychopath, you're actually got to confront the different angle on what you've actually done. And you've got to confront all the parts in a more whole making vision there. And then you realize that, oh, wow, maybe I'm part of the problem. You know, maybe the conditions were such that the othering is just that, just this projection of what is a far more complex and demanding process of the inner journey. And there are distinctions, discernment, and boundaries to be made here that are perhaps the only approach to understanding what it means for peace, because we do need peace. It's exhausting living in a state of terror, in a state of tension, in a state of othering, because once there's that othering and that sense of threat, it just never comes to an end until you're able to undergo a transformational process. And that is possible under certain conditions, and that's what we need to realize, I think, that peace isn't just some thing that is off the cards because of our intoxication by power and by necessity. It's actually what gives meaning to life. And unless we want to just play this game, more primitive game of killing each other ad infinitum, you know, which we can do. We can, you know, some of us can certainly do that. But until we have a vision of peace and understand at a high resolution level how to actually create that structurally, relationally, personally, interpersonally, and have a will to actually make the smallest step towards that, the disruption isn't going to be adequate to prevent that annihilation, really.
Thank you, Cam. That's a powerful way to bring things to a close. And I think we will do that now, just in the interest of keeping this to roughly around 2 hours. I think there's an onwards nod there, perhaps for those listening, for us to reconnect with some of what was coming through in that dialogue with Forrest. I'll just leave that a little bit vague, but I think it's interesting. I think there's an important nod to the esoteric that Cam's making. In that sense, what is the possibility and the responsibility? Touch back on a question Jacob raised in his article. Responsibility here in this case for those of us who can cobble together the time and energy to share in the kind of process where being with at least some of the multiplicity of this is possible, but to do so in a way that roots itself in something of real dignity and integrity. Yes, I do wonder about the onwards movement involving the practical discernment of boundaries, membranes, and that whole landscape of the practical necessity of moving, building in the world, that therefore also brings back in those dynamics of the carnal, of sexuality, of power, and again of violence. And yet that orientation toward peace in that deeper sense of inner process, or at least involving that sense of inner work in that way that's spoken about so much, that does seem to be present in everyone that I have truly valued as, I suppose, a collaborative teacher, let's say. Someone who I can participate in learning with in some reciprocal sense. So, very grateful for you all, very grateful for your time and energy. And yeah, let's bring this to a close. I'll stick around for a little bit, so thank you.